Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Go ahead with your meal if you're eating, or complete getting your meal if you're still in line. There might be a few latecomers, usually are, and we'll accommodate them as they arrive. But we want to get started so we can stay on schedule. I'm David Clement, Executive Director of the Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Seminole campus of St. Petersburg College. Now, your program indicates that Provost Mark Strickland was going to be giving this welcome, but he's unable to be here because that flu bug caught him, the one that's going around. So he's home fighting that flu bug. I hope that you have enjoyed or are still enjoying the meal catered by Nature's Table. Thank you, Nature's Table, for a great meal. And let's also recognize our media co-sponsors. The Tampa Bay Times and WEDU Television always do us justice by promoting our events. This evening, there's somebody else to thank. This evening, it marks a first for the Institute in its 6 years of doing these dinner programs. We are pleased to partner with Petersburg College tonight, which has made this and our next dinner program part of its Osher Lifelong Learning Institute winter season. So would our guests from Petersburg's Lifelong Learning Institute please raise your hands so we can recognize you? Thank you all. Good to have you here. And Eckert's Institute offers a broad array of classes geared to people whose curiosity about the world prompts them to keep learning and studying. And that's not unlike our own faithful supporters here who keep coming back for our forums because they believe, like us, that good food and good conversation go together, and that we can enjoy both in a civil way. So let's begin once again, look at the polling question. If you came in late or didn't get a chance to vote, remember you can only vote once. Here's one more chance, if Jonathan will post it. The question, have you ever experienced or witnessed a hate crime, a hate offense, or been part of committing one? And you vote using your text application of your smartphone, if you have one. And you begin by typing the word FIN1 to the number 22333. So the person you're dialing is 22333, and your message is FIN1. That should get you into the survey, and then once in, you answer A if your answer is yes, B if your answer is no, and C if you're not sure. And I'll wait 30 seconds. If anyone is having trouble getting it, please raise your hand, and maybe someone on the staff, or if there's a student in the audience who's very clever with electronics could help. I don't see any hands raised. There's a couple hands over here. If Jacqueline or Shantae could help. A student? Michael, can you help, please? Jacqueline, do you know how to help? Okay, I'm going to move. Jonathan, if you leave it up there another minute or two. There's a couple folks still waiting, but I'm going to move on. We will discuss the results after the speakers have spoken. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to the person who will moderate tonight's discussion. Maura Sweeney describes herself as an accomplished storyteller and a student of changing cultures and geopolitics. We're certainly in the middle of that right now, aren't we? She's a much sought-after motivational speaker who focuses on influence, leadership, and emotional intelligence in her writings, podcasts, blogs, and international speaking engagements with the goal of positively impacting culture. Her full biography is in your program, and without further ado, I would like to bring on Maura Sweeney.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone. Is this the largest crowd you've ever had? Largest? I think it is. Anyway, welcome. I'm honored to be here as tonight's moderator. Very excited, too. I just have a few opening statements. My website, called Maura for You, bears my name, Maura, but it also discloses my persona, because whoever you are, I'm for you. I'm an advocate for all of humanity, not just a part. So I'd like to open tonight with a half-century-old quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, which everyone here will recognize, but you'll also appreciate when you hear some of my editorial additions. Here it is. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, or their religion, or their culture, or their sexual orientation, etc., but by the content of their character. The content of their character. So 50 years from now, will we be viewed as a people of character among those who help bring solutions and betterment to the family of our greater humanity? I invite everyone here this evening to open your minds, open your imagination, and listen as we explore topics that appear at present to be dividing our nation. Can we aim higher, seeing similarities and commonalities rather than separation, division, and strife? If we can, we may be individual and collective architects of a greater society, one that other societies around the world can learn, glean from, and emulate. So let's get started. We'd like to welcome to the stage tonight our keynote speaker, Angela King. Ms. King is a former violent right-wing extremist who left that lifestyle to co-found Life After Hate. It's a 501c3 organization, and it's dedicated to inspiring individuals and communities to a place of compassion and forgiveness for everyone. She serves that organization as deputy director, in addition to her roles, like tonight, as a speaker, consultant, and an author. Her full biography is in your program. So, ladies and gentlemen, please let us give a warm welcome to Angela King.
Hi. Can you all hear me all right? She told me to talk loud. So I want to thank David for inviting me here and allowing me to be a part of this and to share some of my experience with you and to give you a little bit of information about violent extremism in the US and specifically the far right. My involvement as a violent extremist and my work with former violent extremists and those trying to disengage is what brings me here today, this evening, I should say. I grew up in South Florida, and I thought I had a normal family. Most of us think we have normal families, right? And then we reach that point where we're like, uh-oh, not so normal. That was certainly the case with my family. I was taught racism and homophobia as a child. From as early as I can remember, I learned racial slurs and stereotypes and homophobic slurs, cruel jokes about people because of how they looked or who they loved. As a young person, I cannot remember sitting around the dinner table asking my parents what they meant when they used certain words to describe people. I just knew. When I was about 9 or 10, I realized that I was gay. I didn't know what to call it. I did know it was not acceptable at home because I heard things like, "You're my daughter, and I will always love you. I will always support you. You could even commit a crime, and I would still love you. But never bring home a black person or another woman." Again, I don't remember what made the connection for me. I didn't know the word gay. I didn't know the word lesbian or bisexual or any of those terms. I don't remember learning the alphabet. I don't remember learning how to add or subtract, but I do remember having to memorize Bible verses that talked about damnation and an eternity in the fiery pits of hell. So as a very young girl, that was what I saw for my future. I was really confused. I went through a lot of really difficult stuff as a young woman. I have struggled with my weight my entire life. I was always the little girl that was on the diet and couldn't eat what the other kids ate. I've always been socially awkward. If it's not really easy, I have a hard time even matching correctly. So I did really good today. By the time I reached middle school, I was being bullied. I was being picked on. I was called names. My mom swears she loves me, but she gave me this horrible haircut that looked like a helmet, but like it was made from a poodle. And that might be great, but for where I was in my life and for what I was dealing with and what was happening to me, it was just another thing that gave people a reason to pick on me. I, in the 7th grade, had my shirt ripped open in front of the entire 7th grade class by the school bully. I think it's safe to say by the time I reached high school, I didn't even really want to exist. I had taken all the bad stuff and internalized it. When I was told I was nothing but fat and ugly, I believed it. I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere, and I searched for that place. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to belong. I found that belonging with a group of neo-Nazi skinheads in my high school. I went as far from myself as I could possibly get. I spent 8 years of my life involved in the violent far right in the US. I hurt myself. I hurt other people. That part of my life ended at the age of 23 when I found myself sitting in a federal prison. I took part in a hate crime. We targeted a store because we thought it would be owned or operated by someone who wasn't white or who had a different religion. It was a guess, and we were right. I deserved to be in that prison. And as much as I don't believe the institution of prison changed my life, I would not trade that experience. I would absolutely take back what I did to hurt others. But the very real human experiences I had in that prison set me on the path that I am on today. Small acts of kindness and compassion shown to me by women who I never would have shown the same respect completely disarmed me. I had no idea what to do with kindness. And that kindness was as simple as a woman of color knowing I was there for a hate crime and teaching me to play cribbage. So what I really want to share with you is that it's possible to change. Because of the kindness I have received from so many, I've had the opportunity not only to change, but to do something with my experiences, not to just let them be in vain. I was released from prison in 2001. I registered at a community college in South Florida, and I sat through a program for 2 years in a row called Student Awareness Day. It's a Holocaust education and prejudice reduction program. I was so ashamed of myself, I couldn't bring myself to even look a Holocaust survivor in the eye. I sat there and I listened to them share their experiences and their pain and the trauma of what they survived. I had a professor who was kind enough to facilitate a meeting between myself and 3 women that worked at the Holocaust Center. So I went down to their office in North Miami one day, and I spent several tear-filled hours pouring out my soul. Every horrible thing I'd done, how I landed in prison, how I got to be there at that conference table sharing it with them that day. And one of the women was a Holocaust survivor named Rita. And she was this very petite woman, but she had these piercing eyes. And I would swear that when she looked at me, she could see straight through my soul, and she knew everything. I wasn't really sure what to expect. At the end of me sharing my experiences, Rita stood up, and she started to come around this conference table. And honestly, I didn't know what she was going to do. I really thought she was going to hit me. But instead, what she did was she came and stood right in front of me, and she looked up at me with those piercing eyes, and she grabbed both of my shoulders and said, "I forgive you." That was a gift that I never could have asked for. I didn't know I needed it. But it was another gift on the path to being here this evening. I want you to know that through research and study, we're starting to learn that people don't just go out and join hate groups because they wake up one day and decide they hate everyone. We're starting to see trends and themes. For instance, you may see it flashing through here, but there's a slide that talks about non-ideological precursors to people becoming involved in violent extremism. These are things like trauma, abuse, being bullied. They're things that we don't know how to deal with. For me, it could have been anything else. It could have been addiction. Very briefly, during my time in high school, before I became involved with the far right, I started hanging out with a gang. I probably would have stayed with that gang had I not been raped. To be able to look back now and to compare the themes that we're seeing with my life, I know that it is possible for us to look at these issues and to look at these problems and to come up with solutions that are not necessarily just automatically writing people off. It's easy to do that. I know. Today, I still struggle, even having been that person, doing the work I do, seeing the current events unfolding around us. Sometimes it takes me hours before I can respond with kindness. It's not something that we can expect everyone to do. I certainly would not ask a person of color or other marginalized group to go out and hug Nazis. It's probably not safe, just in case anyone was thinking of doing that. All jokes aside, though, the gift that Rita gave me, it was nothing that I could even identify as something that I needed. It was something that she offered freely. I couldn't have asked her for it, but because of that gift, I stand here tonight. So when we think about violent extremism and we see the things going on around us in our country, I ask you please to keep these things in mind, to know that one kind act, one compassionate word could be the difference that changes the entire course of a human life. I know you saw the survey. Usually when I speak, I ask 2 questions, and they're questions to get people thinking. They're questions that break down walls, very similar to the survey. How many of us in here have ever laughed at, told a joke about, made fun of someone because of how they looked, how big or small they were, how much money they did or didn't have, their religion, their race, the language they spoke, their sexual or gender identity? I'm not the only one in this room. It's not easy to answer in a big room full of people. But then I'll ask you another one. How many of us have been on the receiving end of any of that? That's much easier for us to answer, right? Knowing how that feels, I don't want to be responsible for making another human being feel that bad about themselves. Knowing the pain of that, that isn't a weight that I ever want to carry again. So when we're out in our daily lives and we come across individuals who have ideas and beliefs that are different, I invite you not to just write them off. And I don't necessarily mean people with far-right beliefs. I mean any kind of beliefs, anything that is different than what we know. Because as human beings, we fear what we don't know, right? We talked about this earlier. When we look into a dark closet and we hear something and we get afraid, it's not because we think a shoe is going to attack us. It's because we don't know what's in that closet lurking in that darkness, right? It's the same thing with people. It's the same thing with difference. When we look at one another, we may worship differently. We may have different names for who we worship, what we worship. We may look different. But at the end of the day, does that put us on different planets? Does that mean we can't have compassion for each other? It doesn't mean I'm better or you're worse. All of these things, sometimes they seem simple to me, and I have to ask myself, is it really that simple? Could I have changed the course of my life with a little bit of kindness or a little bit of compassion? And I know the answer to that is yes. I fell through a lot of cracks. I didn't just hate everyone. I hated myself. Some of the work that I do puts me in a position to do interventions and to run support networks for people like myself. Or I should say people like who I used to be. People who are afraid. People who don't know the answers. When I speak with these individuals, they don't say, I hate a whole group of people because here's the list of all the things they did. It's usually all the things they don't know about those people, all the questions. There was an individual who contacted us a few years ago, and he hated Muslims. He didn't really have a reason to hate Muslims. He had a lot of misinformation. There were a lot of things he didn't understand about Islam, about the religion, about the practices. So instead of just having arguments with him about how he was wrong, we brought him to a mosque and we introduced him to an imam who was able to answer his questions. And when he had answers to those questions, that fear, that anger, that hatred, there was no space for it. Not one bit. Bless you. In this way, with these support groups, it's difficult. It's difficult to hear the racial or religious or homophobic slurs that used to come out of my mouth come out of the mouths of others. But when they do, I try to meet them not with anger and contempt and disgust, but with the same kind of kindness that changed my life. I see some of you nodding, and I see some of you wondering, how do we do that? The way I like to think about it is that the easy thing for me to do is to respond with that same kind of ugliness and aggression. That's my instinct. I have not become completely successful. There are times when I still get angry. But I aspire every single day to not meet that aggression with the same. I feel like I'm missing out on something huge.
So sorry. I'm supposed to be keeping time and I have no phone. Go ahead. You're doing fine.
Are you sure?
I'm sure.
Okay.
I'm gonna go run and get my phone for the time. Keep going.
All right, that kind of threw me off a little bit. So I want to use an example. Road rage. We all know it. We have all felt it, right? So imagine you're on your way to work one day and somebody cuts you off. And you are already having a horrible day. Your hair is not doing what you want it to do. You maybe didn't pick out the best outfit that day. You're not comfortable. It's already turning out to be a rough day, right? Someone cuts you off, and you shoot them a bird out the window. I've done it. I try really hard not to anymore. But look at the ripple effects of that. You get in a bad mood. You go to work. Usually, you would hold the door open for someone. You would smile. You would say good morning. But you don't do that morning. You don't hold the door open. Maybe the next person thought you were going to and end up dropping everything they were carrying. Maybe someone was late for an interview and you didn't feel like holding the elevator because you were having a bad morning. So imagine how many individuals that might affect just on your way to your office or your desk. Imagine the ripple effects of that. It's easy to fall into that. Imagine how much more strength it takes to smile through it, to say good morning, to hold the door, to hold the elevator, to not flip that bird. Imagine the ripple effects of that. These things seem simple, right? Don't they seem pretty simple? But these are things we can do around us in our daily lives that will have these gigantic ripple effects. So when we talk about things like violent extremism, when we see horrible things being said on our social media and we see people being treated horribly, we have the power to stop that dead in its tracks. We have the power to make that difference. I can't lie to you and tell you that every person can be saved with kindness, that every person can be saved with compassion, but I can tell you that a lot can. I can tell you we don't have to buy it or sell it. All it takes is that one word. So now I know my time is almost up.
I'm watching. 2 minutes. You got 2 more minutes to go.
I know. I just have to tease you. So, to close, I get to speak with people that are the epitome of what I was, the epitome of fear, the epitome of no self-confidence, of internalizing bullying and trauma and negativity. And I get to tell them that that's not the end of their story. The end of their story can be completely different than the beginning. All they have to do is see through that darkness and just be willing to be open to it. So I saved this part till the end. I know I'm not supposed to do this, but I'm going to. So, how many of us are having those divisive conversations about politics? Yeah, I know, right? Okay, so no matter what side we fall on, I'm going to leave you with the thought that what we see going on is so much more than a political party. It's about being a human being. I wasn't always the human being that I was supposed to be, but I can tell you that today I am. And I thank you for being a part of that conversation and for being the kind of human beings who are going to show up and listen and learn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angela. That was wonderful and right on time. Okay. We decided to have a little change, which is what was going on. Instead of having each speaker speak while they were sitting down, they're going to come directly to the stage. Well, let's now invite our next panelists to the stage. Each one of these, by the way, are going to discuss the issue of hate from their own perspective. Our first is Ms. Gina Duncan. Gina is Director of Transgender Equity for Equality Florida. Please welcome her.
Good evening. How is everyone? I am Gina Duncan. I am the Director of Transgender Equality at Equality Florida. How many of you have heard of Equality Florida? Yes. Equality Florida is the state's largest LGBT advocacy organization, representing at this point almost 300,000 members. And I'm very pleased to be with you today and speaking on behalf of the transgender community as a very proud and open transgender woman. While there's been societal progress in the area of LGBT rights and protections, so have we seen the increase in the emergence of LGBTQ hate groups. The number of active hate groups in Florida ranks second among other states in the nation. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are currently 63 active hate groups in Florida, ranking second only behind what state? Anybody want to guess? California. Yeah. You'd think Texas, wouldn't you? Which has 79. A central theme of anti-LGBTQ organizing and ideology is opposition to basic LGBTQ rights and protections, often couched in rhetoric and harmful pseudoscience that demonizes the community and sees the LGBT community as threats to children, women, society, and often public safety and health. The transgender community has been especially targeted since the passage of marriage equality in our country. Hate groups have been targeting transgender people of all ages, citing public safety issues in public places, and what we have all heard, the bathroom argument, right? Bathroom bills. While the bathroom bill hate speech has been dispelled time and time again through studies and polls and facts that there has been no increases in public safety issues where fully inclusive human rights ordinances have been passed, that hate speech still continues. We find that the accommodations rhetoric from hate groups remain the target of choice. Sadly, anti-LGBTQ groups are cloaked in religious fundamentalism, primarily consisting of Christian right groups, but also include organizations like the American College of Pediatricians and the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality that falsely purports to be scientific in nature. More recently, hardline anti-LGBT groups have promoted religious freedom and religious liberty legislation and legal challenges to justify anti-LGBTQ discrimination across our state. This idea is particularly compelling to millions of evangelicals who see themselves and their values as being under siege in a rapidly changing society. Across this country, these opponents of equality are working to persuade state legislators and legislatures to pass laws known as Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, RFRAs, which you've probably heard of, statutes that ostensibly allow individuals to deny goods and services to LGBTQ people on the basis of their religious beliefs. To counter this, despite hostile opposition across the state, Equality Florida has helped pass over 40 fully comprehensive human rights ordinances at the city and county levels, now protecting roughly 60% of Florida's population from discrimination in the areas of housing, employment, and public accommodations. Yes. And as you might know, frustratingly, for 10 years, Equality Florida has been working to pass a statewide non-discrimination law. We were just up in Tallahassee at Lobby Days pushing to pass the Florida Competitive Workforce Act, which would give us a statewide law so we wouldn't have this patchwork of human rights ordinances. Finally, hate groups promote violence against LGBTQ communities, especially alarming against the transgender community. In 2015, it was reported that a transgender person was murdered once every 3 days somewhere in the world. In 2016, at least 23 transgender people were reported murdered in the United States, and 2017 was the deadliest year on record. For transgender Americans, as at least 25 transgender people were reported murdered in that year. The majority of victims, as you might know, were transgender women of color. The youngest were just 17 and the oldest 59. While the details of these cases differ, it is clear that fatal violence disproportionately affects the transgender community and specifically transgender women of color. It is also abundantly clear that hate groups intersect the aspects of racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia to conspire to deprive Americans and transgender people of employment, housing, health care, and other necessities that they need every day. I gotcha. Hate groups in our state have been instrumental in perpetuating bigoted myths, hate speech and violence, and preventing full equality for all Floridians. I hope that we can work together to move forward in this issue. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. Our next up is Mr. Hasan Shibli. Hasan is Chief Executive Officer of the Council on American Islamic Relations here in Florida. Let's welcome him now.
Thank you so much. In the name of the God of Abraham, the most gracious, the most merciful, may the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. It's a tremendous honor and a blessing for me to be here with all of you. And I want to thank the Institute for having this very important conversation on one of the biggest threats that faces our nation. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security tried to release a report that the biggest threat of domestic terrorism in the United States is from white supremacist groups. And we know that the White House actually crushed and buried that report and wouldn't allow its release because they don't want that kind of information out there. Because unfortunately, far too often, incidents of violence are seen from a political lens to further political agendas, not to foster an environment of safety and humanity and compassion, which is what I believe all of us really stand for. Unfortunately, over the last year, CARE Florida, which is grown to be one of the largest civil rights organizations in the states that represents any victim of discrimination or harassment or hate crimes, regardless of race or religion or ethnicity, we've documented a 500% increase in anti-Muslim hate crimes and hate incidents in the state of Florida over the last 2 years. Unfortunately, this is anything from a person calling a mosque and saying, I'm going to come over there and shoot all of you up, whether you're 2 years old or 100 years old, to young children being bullied and called Taliban terrorists by their own teachers at public schools, to incidents of violence and mosques being burnt down. So it's been a challenging year, and unfortunately, one of the sad facts is people they're driven by so much hate, they don't even know who they're hating. So one of the biggest victims of Islamophobic hate crimes that we've documented is often people who aren't even Muslim. In New York City, a Hindu man was pushed to his death in front of the subway by a woman who thought he was Muslim. In another state, we had a Sikh temple shot at, with 9 members of the Sikh community killed. And ultimately, I think that highlights that one of the biggest problems really is ignorance. Ignorance leads to misunderstanding, the misunderstanding leads to fear, the fear leads to hate, and the hate ultimately leads to acts of violence and discrimination and undermining the fundamental principles of liberty and justice and diversity that makes America so great. The University of Georgetown has documented that the rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes and hate incidents is not connected to bad things done by Muslims. Because there are bad things done by people of every race and every religion and every group out there. And there is no bigger threat coming out of any particular religion or race or nationality. In fact, nobody's been killed by a terrorist from the banned countries in the United States in over 40 years. So again, it's not about safety or freedom or liberty. It's about hypocrisy. And what hate groups do, unfortunately, is they utilize double standards and taking things out of context to portray the other as a threat. And in portraying the other as a threat, one is it incites incidents of violence, but two is it makes the public willing to tolerate those incidents of violence, but also more concerning, it makes the public willing to tolerate the undermining of those groups' freedom and liberty, which is something that we consistently struggle with. So Georgetown University has shown that anti-Muslim hate in this country is not connected to bad things done by people who call themselves Muslim. Rather, it's connected to politicians who don't have real answers to the real problems plaguing this country, demonizing minorities so that they can gather votes, so that they can gather power and authority. That's what it's about. And unfortunately, it's also connected to the Islamophobia industry. The Islamophobia industry, you can learn about it by reading the report Fear Inc., which you can download online, again, Fear Inc. or Fear Inc. 2.0, or you can go to CARE's own Islamophobia report, which is at the website islamophobia.org. It shows how, over the last few years, over $200 million has been spent to demonize the Muslim community in America. And they actually have copied the Nazi playbook. Literally, they're promoting the same lies against the Muslim community today that was promoted against the Jewish community in Nazi Germany 70 years ago. In fact, I was at another forum and a friend of mine who was a rabbi said what's being said about Muslims today is no different than what was said about Jews in Germany 7 years ago, that all Muslims are liars, that Muslims cannot be trusted, that their religion commands them to take over the world. That was exactly what the Nazis said about the Jews, that they want to take over the world, that they cannot be trusted, that they cannot be loyal. This was actually said about the Catholics in this country as well, that Catholics are loyal to the Pope, that they could not be trusted. So it's the same hate, just a new target. And that's why it's unfortunately not shocking that in one study, about 50% of Americans actually supported the idea that Muslims should have to wear special ID cards. We know the last group, what happened to the last group that had to wear special ID cards. 70% of those who voted for this current administration supported the idea of outlawing Islam in America. And that offends me as an American, it offends me as a lawyer long before it offends me as a Muslim. In fact, that's the problem with Islamophobia. It makes us less safe and it makes us less free. It undermines our liberty at home, and it promotes conflict globally. So we, in the 2 minutes we have remaining, I'll just share with you, one of the most troubling laws we pushed back against was in Tennessee. In Tennessee, they tried to pass a law that practicing Islam is treason, punishable by 20 years in jail. And that is promoted by one of the leading anti-Muslim hate groups, Act for America. That's very active in Florida. Florida is one of its most active states. Every single year they've tried to pass legislation in Tallahassee that undermines the freedom of Muslims to practice their religion, and also that deletes accurate information about Islam from the textbooks here in this state. Because, you know, what's the biggest enemy to fear and hate other than truth and knowledge? So they want to eliminate textbooks. So one of the biggest hate groups, unfortunately, very active, Act for America, trying to outlaw practicing Islam in America, and trying to promote ignorance and fear and hatred of the Muslim community. And again, we saw them trying to pass laws in Tennessee and other places. And the crazy part is when I met with Florida legislators who were considering laws written by the person who was trying to outlaw Islam, I said, how can you consider laws written by somebody who wants to make a religion illegal? And they had no problem with it. You know, there's still a high level of tolerance. So I'll leave this, you know, and we can have more discussion later, but in the 1 minute I have remaining, I will say, we must all remember that our enemies can never defeat us. We can only defeat ourselves if we allow fear and hate to turn us against each other and be willing to undermine the principles of liberty and justice that make America great. Let us work together as we do at CARE and hope for all of us together for a society where children of all people, regardless of their race or religion, can grow up proud of who they are without fear of intimidation or harassment. Let's work stronger for our love than they work for their hate. Thank you, and God bless you. Peace be with you.
Thanks, Hasan. Very nice. And finally, this is last but certainly not least, we have with us Mr. Jack Packer. He is a professor of social and behavioral science right here at St. Petersburg College.
Good evening. Now, I'm not sure of my audience, but if I was in a very comfortable audience, I would say, why does the black guy have to be last? Now, go ahead and laugh, because I tell my students that if you have a closed mind, get out of my class, because you can't learn. If you start predetermining what people will say and how they will act, and how you should feel, you should think about that. But briefly, the historical perspective from my perspective is that we have to ask ourselves, how did we get here? We have hate groups coming out of nowhere. So I want to give you something that you may not like and be appealing, but it's going to make sense as I briefly talk, because I know I have to sit down, is that we know that certain things, little creatures like roaches and stuff, when we turn the light on, they scurry away. But you need to know that they're not afraid of the light. They're afraid of what will happen once the light is on. And I want you to think about that. Think about it as an institutional, let's say, aurora or umbrella, such as our government. Hate groups come out now historically because, and each time we've seen an increase, it's when our government has seemed to be laxed. And they will keep coming because the light is on, but they don't fear retribution. So, moving on, keep that thought in mind historically. What would you say was the first hate group? Anyone? KKK, 1866. Being a little controversial, if you stick to the strict interpretation of hate group, and some people are going to walk out now, the first American hate group was in 1787 during the Constitutional Convention, our founding fathers. That was the first hateful group. And from what the decisions they made and what they would tactfully approve by direct action or lack of action would open the door to what we have now. See, one of the things I point out to my students that America, if you know your history, has never dealt with the incorporation and integration of non-whites into this country properly. We've never had that historically. Our institutional overlords, as we became a new nation, Supreme Court, 1857, Dred Scott case. where the Chief Justice said black people aren't property. They aren't real humans. They're property. And he made it clear, and I'm not just talking about slaves, I'm talking about them in general. They can never be equal, nor should they ever be citizens. And a lot of folks today want to say that racism is in the South. That's not true. Racism is everywhere. It was in the North where they came about with anti-immigration laws for blacks, not the South, the North, who said, we don't want too many here. And when you go from the Dred Scott decision of saying blacks are property to the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which they threw away and said that's too good, to the Plessy versus Ferguson case, 1896, where they said separate but equal, you cannot take historically our government out of this picture. And I also tell my students that to tell the American story, you just have to look at the black-white relationship, because all others have problems and there are challenges. But if you want to know how we got here, look at where we have been and what we have done and what we have not done. And I want you to remember about the historical placement of institutions, because it is our strength. And if we ever lose sight that we don't need them forcefully in control and powerfully protecting all people, then we will have that problem. All nations, quickly with a history lesson here, those that have risen and fallen subjugated themselves to losing their institutions and allowing them to decay. Whether they were dictators or not, they fell because internal corruption ate away their soul. And then when they needed it, they had no internal, let's say, structure to protect the rights of the people. So historically, I'd like to just leave this with you. The Europeans came here in the great exploration stage and landed here and did a great thing. America's a great country. I love it. And I've told people I wouldn't live anywhere else. But it is not a country. Our country is not one, thank you, without fault. You have to understand, and I keep saying we must know where we've been to know where we are, that the Europeans came with stringent class divisions. They were totally separated, and it wasn't warm and fuzzy. They came here to take, to pillage, to rape, to plunder. But somewhere in there, a great country was made called America. I said the greatest country alive. But if you follow us through history, just following the African-American track, you know that we've had some problems. And see, it didn't begin to be a problem until after the Civil War. You say, oh, wait a minute, that was slavery. Yes. But there were also black slave owners and whatnot. But after the Civil War is when America defined itself that it would be along racial lines. It was after the Civil War when blacks were forced to leave their land. They were forced into another form of slavery called sharecropping. They were denied rights. They were put in schools that weren't any good based on anything else. But I'd like to say here, as I end, there are many black hate groups, as there are white. And there is no justification for either, regardless of color. And remember the little history lesson I've given you, and that hate crimes they don't target individuals, although individuals feel, they target communities. And at the bottom of all of that, it's about power and identity and control. And we must not allow that to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Well, everyone here, I would agree, has made some unbelievably great and very thought-provoking comments. We'd like to get to a few of them in greater depth, but first, we have an instant survey. It shows that, survey says, okay, what is the percentage there that my eyes are not showing me? It looks like we're way, way up, like in the high 90s. 57% say yes. They have been either involved in committing a hate offense. They've witnessed one, experienced one, or have been involved in one. Thank you for all the honest people. And the percentage that have not is 33%. And the remaining Group that said not sure is 10%. Okay, thank you. Well, let's now take a couple of minutes. I guess we're going to be discussing this at the individual tables. I know there's always one great volunteer at each table that would like to serve taking notes from their other table mates. And then I would like for some of you to give us a brief report on your findings, okay? So we're gonna take, I think, 3 or 4 minutes. I'd like to bring everyone's attention to the front so we could hear. First of all, Samantha and Michael, please raise your hands for everyone to see. Samantha, Michael, they have microphones. They are looking for a few good volunteers to be the sharer of what your table has to say about tonight's comments. Who would like to go first? What table? Right up front. Okay.
You want to hold? Sure, no problem. I'm good. Hi, I'm Merritt. I just wanted to, it's going to have to be here otherwise.
Please, everyone, can you give your attention?
Thanks.
Thank you.
We had 3 examples at the table from the 60s of a young black man in Alabama wanting to join the football team and being beaten to a pulp by the rest of his team so that he couldn't be on the team by the time they were finished with him. And in Canton, Ohio, the YMCA was segregated, and for a whole lot of reasons, they wanted to have blacks and whites involved in swimming and doing athletics together, but the whites wouldn't swim in the pool. If the blacks had been in it, they had to drain the pool and clean it and scrub it and then fill it again, and after doing that about 4 times, it was so expensive, it was financial, the decision to go and continue to have a integrated pool use. And then I had an example from Canada. I'm Canadian, from the Park Plaza Hotel. We had an absolutely beautiful black actress come to the Park Plaza with her child and was swimming in the pool in the 60s. And after I think it was Carol Baker, after she and her kids got out of the pool, they drained it and cleaned it and then filled it up with clean water again. So just horrific and disgusting and sad, and that was the 60s.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Michael, do you have someone from the next table? Would you be kind enough to stand up so we can see you and get your name as well?
Hello, my name is Jessica Antoine, and I'm a student here. It's okay. Okay, my whole table here agreed with the speakers. They're right in the middle of what they were speaking about. It actually is getting worse. Hate occur in every places in America. Americans isolate themselves against different people in different group and race because the general population is uneducated and also not open-minded. Open-minded in different culture and race. And not only that, they're not willing to accept and introduce themselves and get to know one another as equal.
Oh, I was going to say people.
Yes. And that's all I have right now.
Thank you very much. Okay, next group. Samantha has someone. Would you like to stand up, please, and identify yourself?
My name,
You're good.
yep, it's on. Okay, my name is Roger. I came all the way over from Tampa. We had a little different approach on our table. We looked around and we felt that we all had one thing in common, and we all grew up about the same time, right after World War II. And that was a starting point for us sort of interpreting what a lot of our speakers had to say. The word tribalism came up, something that was not talked about back in the 1950s and 60s that I know of. They may have been around, but it wasn't part of the common language where we had tribal approaches to different issues in the country. A second thing we talked about is that during the war years and World War II, it was more of a sense of people working together You've seen the movies where, you know, you have all the ethnic groups who are a squad of soldiers and they all put their differences aside and they fulfill their mission. That apparently does not exist as much as it did, or now as it did back in those years, and it slipped away from us. And we were just getting to the point about why that happened, and I'll just add a point maybe to help sum it up. I think we're seeing a failure in the education system, perhaps, in pushing some of the basic tenets of where our country came from. As our last speaker said, we all started, you know, as a country with you know, general goals, but over the years, it's gone back and forth from one extreme to the other, it seems, and now it seems like everything is an extreme. I think that's.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next we probably have time. Let's see, 7:25. I think we have time for one more table at least. No, we don't. 7:25. Where's our leader here? Time to move on. Sorry. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. What's some of the audience? We hear the tables. All right. Now it's time for a little bit of a conversation. Let's wait. I think we're going to. One question I have for everyone, and I'm so glad you mentioned this, Jack. You said you don't have to be white to hate. You don't have to be black to hate. People just hate. And I'd kind of like to open it up with just that question. Now that we've heard from everyone, what do you think is the best way of handling hate as an individual and or a group? Anyone want to start? Best way to handle it. You deal with hate all the time. Best way.
You know, we find that people are, as was said earlier, people are afraid of who and what they don't know. And we find in advocacy work that just simple storytelling of humanizing the LGBTQ community does so much. We were just up in Tallahassee at Lobby Days this past week talking to lawmakers about, you know, passing the Florida Competitive Workforce Act. And you'd be surprised how many elected officials in Tallahassee have never met a transgender person, yet they're debating policy about transgender people. And yet they're certainly not running out there to find transgender people to have a town hall meeting with. So it's all about getting to know different segments of our community. It's all about eliminating the other and the divisiveness within our country, and finding that we all have the same aspirations, shared goals of being able to provide for our families, you know, have our own piece of the American dream, and, you know, live for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness like our Constitution says.
Thank you very much, Gina. Anyone else want to comment the best way to deal with hate?
I didn't know if I was going to be able to get to it, but that's a good segue. And I'll tell you a story. As a captain and assigned to 1st Cavalry Division, a regiment, I should say, in Germany, as I arrived, I was the only black officer there. And one day in the barracks, as we were inspecting, a white soldier from South Carolina got in trouble, so the NCOs brought him to me. And I was counseling him, and he looked at me and he said, you know, I just don't like niggers. I can't deal with you. Now, this is an enemy telling the officer. So my NCOs immediately grabbed him. They were going to throw him in the stockade. Those days, you disappear. I said, no. Bring him back. And I said, you know what? I need a driver, and you're going to be my driver. Now, true story. And my NCO's eyes almost said, sir, are you crazy? Because back those days, we had weapons. He said, are you out of your mind? What does this young man just call you? He hates you. I said, no, I want to be my driver. I said, I'll just be careful. Now, we went through a lot, but in 3 years, I'm here to tell you, that young man became one of my best friends, because over time, I could see him changing as he got to know that I was not an animal. I was just like him, had a family, and in fact, we had some things in common. We had family in South Carolina in the same town. So I tell you that story, and it tells itself about how we can react to racism.
Very good. Thanks. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Hassan, you want to
The
comment?
personal interaction is critical because a lot of times when you find the studies in the polls, for example, when it comes to people who want to ban Muslims or make us wear special ID cards or just make our faith illegal, usually they don't know anybody in their life who's a Muslim. And American Muslims are 1% of the population, so as much as I would love to, we just can't get to know everybody, right? But that's where you all can play a role. I would urge all of you to have serious conversations within your churches, your synagogues, your professional organizations, and see what people really believe about their fellow neighbors who happen to practice Islamic faith or Hindu faith or other faiths or races or ethnicities or groups, and then challenge back the misunderstanding and racism, and then find ways to connect. So get somebody like from this panel to speak at your local church or synagogue or civic organization, organize community service events together with the local mosque or church, and pull people together for community service. So that's something directly we can do, serving society at home together to make Tampa or St. Pete the best place it can be for everyone. Secondly is support those organizations that are committed to pushing back against hate, and make that part of your estate planning. Make that part of your legacy that you leave behind. Support those institutions that are working to push back against the hate.
Good, thank you. Thank you. Good for you.
I think
And
from
we can't hear you? Try. I have a different question for you unless you want to answer that too, but I think it's very much in line with you. Talk about what motivates people to leave the hate groups, and just discuss what some of the challenges are to it, and maybe what some suggestions you might be able to give. It's not an easy thing to leave hate, right?
No, it's not at all. So, like I mentioned earlier, some of the themes that we're starting to see are that individuals don't just get involved in hate groups because they wake up one day and decide they hate everyone. There are some voids that they're trying to fill. So some of the things that we're seeing are acts of kindness and compassion. For me personally, I went to prison for a hate crime. I claim to hate people that I never took the time to get to know. And I smoked cigarettes back then. I do not any longer. But in prison one day, I was, sitting there chain smoking, and this woman of color looked at me, and I was thinking, she's going to do something to me. She's sizing me up. I have to defend myself. And she did the worst thing ever. She looked at me and said, "You know how to play cribbage?" And, small acts of kindness, they are disarming. She picked up this cribbage board and this deck of cards, and she walked over to me and sat down next to me like, she knew me, and she taught me how to play this game. And she knew I was there for a hate crime. So things like that, those small acts, they just completely disarm. And then what was the second part of it?
How do you get out of a hate group when you're already part of it? What is the biggest advice you could give about actually extricating yourself from a group that really wants you, is claiming you, and you're fearful of the leave?
That is a loaded question.
Yeah, it probably is. Maybe it's beyond today. If you could give us a little nugget.
Yes. Some of the obstacles that we see when individuals try to disengage from these groups, once they're there, well, I'll back up a little. They don't go there because they necessarily hate. They go there looking to fill a void. Once the group kind of gets them and pulls them in, their entire identity is created around the group and its beliefs. So coming out of that identity is gone, and an individual has now ostracized all the people in their life that could have potentially helped them out of that. So it's rebuilding identity. It is making choices that are personal and on a case-by-case basis for each person. For instance, when I made the decision to leave, I knew that I had to burn every bridge possible back. So I cooperated in my criminal case. And I had knowledge of things that I was no longer willing to accept. I knew that the people I associated with were violent, and they were planning violence. So there are all different kind of things that
It takes
that
a
go
lot
in
of
there.
courage, right? Sometimes I think we think that it takes a lot of courage to join a group, but it takes a lot of courage to leave. Now, we've talked...
I don't think so. I'm sorry. I think it's just being the kind of human being I should have always been and wasn't.
True.
But
Well,
thank you.
All right, well, but I don't know, I've never joined a hate group, but I would think it takes courage to do that. All right, now could we switch a little bit, because we were talking about, you know, this right-wing radical behavior, and now we have something on the other side, the flip side, Antifa. So now we have this anti-group fighting against a hate group and using more violence. Anyone want to comment on that? Is it okay, in order to stop violence, that you create new violence?
Let me toss something out there. I have a colleague who is also a co-founder of Life After Hate, and he said something that makes a lot of sense to me. I hope it makes sense to you too. What he said essentially was he was never at a Klan rally or at a neo-Nazi march where someone threw a rock at his head or a bottle, and he said, I have to rethink my beliefs now because someone threw a rock or a bottle at my head. We have this conversation about, and this is a very complicated conversation that we need to have about where is that line between is it or is it not okay to punch a Nazi, and unpacking violence as a form of self-defense and protecting human life.
You know, one of my favorite quotes in the Quran, I'll give the translation of, God says, what's translated as, you know, the evil act and the good act is not equal. Respond to evil with that which is better, and you will find your worst enemy becomes your best friend. But only those who are patient and have good fortune will achieve this. It requires patience, and you cannot defeat hate with hate. You can only defeat it with love and compassion, right? And that's how you build those bridges. So on one hand, to defeat hate, we have to invest more in outreach and in service. At the same time, though, and I can't comment on Antifa because I don't know enough about it, but at the same time, we can't allow ourselves to become victims. So when we documented the 500% increase in hate crimes, we started talking about people exercising their Second Amendment right to carry and to protect themselves and their family and their loved ones, which, you know, with the amount of death threats that I've been receiving against myself and my children, I started carrying. You know, so we have to consider serious measures to defend ourselves sometimes. We can't just allow those who have hate to act violence and not expect the people to stand up and defend themselves.
If I can, we probably have only time for maybe one or two more questions, and then we'll open it up to everyone else. But there was one other chair we had planned on having here tonight, and that was for a Jewish organization. And as it turned out, none of them were willing to sit with us. And the response that we got is that they were concerned about CARE, thinking that CARE was a terrorist organization. So I know you want to respond to that.
You know, that amazes me because we have phenomenal relationships with many of our Jewish brothers and sisters in our leadership. And I think what it comes out to is just, it's a shame to see people employing the same hate tactics that were employed against their forefathers, against the next minority. So I would love and I would invite any of those people to come to my home, to come to my mosque, to come to my office, unannounced, and get to know their brother and sister in humanity, for we're all the children of Abraham.
Very good. Very good.
And you know, I'd like to chime in on that because I can relate to that as far as the transgender community, in the fact that for the longest time the transgender community stayed in the shadows for fear of violence and harassment and marginalization. And it's only been the last 5 to 10 years that the transgender and gender nonconforming communities have begun to emerge. In our organization, we advocate visibility leads to awareness, awareness leads to education, and education will lead to equality. So we ask and we create safe spaces for transgender young people as well as old people my age to step out of the shadows and feel safe to be visible so we can tell our stories and we can become part of society.
Very good, thank you. And you could tell I'm looking at the clock here. Thank you. I think we have one other question. Now, recently, it was a few months ago, we had 2 neo-Nazis in Tampa killed by a fellow neo-Nazi who picked up his faith in Islam and in jihadist causes. Do you see any continuation of that taking place or anything like it that any of you would like to comment on?
You know, one of the interesting things is I think, you know, extremists, I don't even call them extremists, we call them deviants, right? It's important, they're heretics. Whether they're heretics from Christianity, joining the KKK, or heretics from Islam, joining Daesh, or as you may know it, called ISIS. Extremists or deviants within every religion have a lot more in common with each other than they do with their people who claim to share the same faith.
Yes.
You know, they're heretics, they're out of the faith, and they share the same religion, the religion of deviance and hate, about serving the ego. And here's a very important point, because I was reflecting over this. You cannot be racist or hateful to others if you believe in God, because if you believe in God, you know that God created all of us. So how can you honor God when you dishonor the creation of God? Makes no sense. They're all heretics.
You know what? Yes, very good point to finish up here. And I agree with you. Their hatred on any form is really not acceptable, and we've got to look for something better. And I agree with you, too. Every group has its own deviance. Okay, so we're ready to go out to the general public. Since we are taping this also, we ask that you would be kind enough to speak on the microphone so others will be able to listen in later.
Okay. Well, when you were talking about the excuse to use violence against another violent group, I mean, you can look back in history, like at the Crusades. That was the Holy War. It was really for money. Yes. If you know history, the Crusades was not about honoring the Pope. I mean, I'm Catholic, so it's not like I'm against Catholics. But to be very truthful, that was a war about money.
So can you turn that into a question for
Well,
the group?
okay.
That's a very good point.
The other point that I was going to make was the Holy War that happened in Ireland. How long did that last? I mean, that was started with the excuse of a religious war, but it wasn't. So I guess my question is, do you believe that when we say we fight for religion, do you believe that's true?
You know, I'm going to agree with you. I don't think it's true. I think they're fighting for a kingdom on earth, not a kingdom in heaven. And that's what these groups are about. Who can have the power, the resources, the land. And they'll brainwash some misguided people who are searching for belonging, right? Searching to be part of something greater than themselves and find acceptance. They'll take advantage of them. But ultimately, it's about power and wealth and greed.
We say discrimination.
Next. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
We say discrimination wrapped in religion is still discrimination. And we see how this can manifest in our schools. The Liberty Council, as you might know, is one of the largest hate groups right here in Central Florida. They're in North Orlando. And the Liberty Council has been impacting school districts all across the state. And how this ends up in acts of violence is Marion County, for example, in Ocala. There was a bathroom issue where a boy went into a bathroom, happened to see a transgender boy in the bathroom, in the stall, complained. They threatened a lawsuit. Marion County School Board threatened the school, or succumbed to the Liberty Council, threatening them with a lawsuit, and said that all transgender and gender nonconforming kids could only use the bathrooms that align with their birth certificates instead of their true gender identity. The suicide rate for K through 12 transgender kids and nonconforming kids is 50%. 50% of gender nonconforming kids in our K through 12 system attempt suicide at some time during that time period. That's how it manifests from discrimination and hate groups to violence.
Okay. Thank you, Gina. Next question.
You mentioned that your representative from the Jewish organization chose not to attend. Did you invite somebody from the Native American organization?
Do you know what? I was not on the organizing committee, so to speak, but I know that there were several. That was the original plan, that we would have the Jewish community here, and I believe there were several that were contacted in the Tampa Bay area, and we were not able to get a representative. But that is another group I thought of as well, right, the Native Americans.
And I just do want to share very quickly that right now, my colleague from CARE Florida is also speaking at USF with Rabbi Rosenberg, who's a proud leader in the Jewish community. So we do interfaith events all the time. It's a shame the people here weren't as open-minded as some of their colleagues are in other places. I don't think they represent the Jewish community at all if they're not willing to sit at the table.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. All right, next question. Thank you.
My name is Lillian, and I'm Jewish. My name is Lillian, and I am Jewish, and I find that very hard to believe because our population is always open to learning and communicating, so something is wrong. But I wonder what is being done on the college campuses to try and educate the students about varieties of people and differences with people? What's happening there? Because there's a lot of anti-Semitism in many, many colleges, on many, many college campuses.
It's all quiet on the Western Front. We don't have a Jewish representative, but go ahead, Jack.
I'm not Jewish. I know I use my class as a platform to inform people of diversity, the problem. And I do it in a history way. Because what we need to understand, that hate groups are evolving. We can talk all day about hate groups, but it's the ones you don't see which are the most dangerous to our society. See, the Ku Klux Klan, the Christian identity, the skinheads are great, and we can all go home remembering that. But as a history teacher, doing my research, I realized that the hate group of yesterday is not the hate group that's the most dangerous today. It's the ones that cover themselves behind the flag of immigration defense or self-defense for America, making things right because politically we're not there yet. We want to structure our government to be a better nation. See, the hate groups have learned, and one thing I'll leave you with is that hate groups are not just crazy people running around. At the core of the most prominent and profound hate groups is a business center. And that center consists of recruitment, radicalization. It's like a fraternity. And the ritual is to bring you in and keep you in. And that is, and I'm not sure what my panel has endured, but once in, to make sure that you are part of the hate group so you can then, in turn, recruit more. But the biggest coup that the hate groups have achieved is the political success. See, as long as we keep dividing ourselves politically, we'll never be able to solve the hate group phenomenon.
Thank you.
Can I add to that?
We have,
Maura?
you know what, I think we've been ignoring this side of the room. Am I right, Michael? Okay, if you don't mind, let's hear from someone here. Go ahead.
My question is to Angela.
Yes.
Have your voting rights been restored?
Yes, they have. I fought for 8 years for them, yes.
And to keep things even, do we need another one from the left here? I think I was leaning all the way to the right. No pun intended.
Why are we kind of taught, I'd like to find out your opinion, not to create conversation? You hear it all the time when we get together as families. Well, don't mention this and don't mention that. Am I imagining things?
Someone here want to comment?
Nope, you're not imagining things. Remember that whole part about you think your family's normal? No, it's happening. And these are conversations that need to start at our dinner tables.
Okay. Now we have someone from the dinner table right up front. Go ahead.
I'm an educator. Do you hear me? In Pinellas County. And about maybe 35, 40 years ago, I read a book called The Dumbing Down of America. And I have seen this progressive change more and more. And I think, personally, and I don't know if you agree, but education has been the key. And that's what I've been screaming about. And as the powers that be keep telling us to dumb our kids down, which is what they're doing in the schools, more and more hate crimes are happening, and it's getting crazier and crazier. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
I think if we look at statistics, particularly this past presidential election, we see that the majority were uneducated white people that voted Trump into power. And that says a lot. It says a lot with the groups that I work with. There's a lot of misinformation and miseducation there and lack of education.
Okay, next.
Hi, I think what I've been, my name's Dodie, and I think what I've been hearing is that if we have relationships with people who are, from whom we are different, that this is going to be some cure-all, and in fact, it is important. But I would tell my class that there are not enough black people around to educate all the white people one-on-one, not enough Muslims around to educate us, that it's our responsibility as white people, all of us who are white in this room, to deal with the white privilege, the white advantage, and the white government that we have. And I'm wondering if any of you feel the same way.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
There was a UCLA study, as I mentioned. There are just evil people in the world. Some people are bad, and we don't know why. And we have to deal with that. What we have to do is construct and put them in a position where they no longer can move our society in the wrong way. And that starts with each of us individually making a decision that we will not tolerate that which is wrong. And it's just going to be here because we can talk this all day, but there are still bad people out there, and they're not listening to this. But if we act accordingly, and I'm going to say again, throw the politics out, because that has been used as a brainwashing tool, and then make the right decisions, then I think we'll do a lot better as a country.
You know, and on that note, what scares me the most isn't necessarily the hatred of the evil people or those who are just blinded by hatred, but it's the silence or complicity of the majority. One of the things that to this day troubles me, I don't know how to swallow it or understand it, is a dear friend, and sorry, but we have to talk about the elephant in the room, a dear friend of mine who went publicly in the local media speaking out against anti-Muslim hate groups and racism, and he's a conservative Republican, and he was very vocal in his support for Trump. And for me, I don't care what you think about Clinton or the politics of it or what political party you're on, the fact that a man wants to ban people who share my faith and thinks people of my faith should have a special registry, the fact that that wasn't enough for you to write him off makes me a little bit afraid of how much of a friend you are to me. That's the, the honest truth.
Next.
2 points very quickly. One, I think the majority of this crowd is already aligned with what's trying to be accomplished here tonight. I agree with the educator. I think the young people at this table who should be here in the majority, so whenever you can share your thoughts with the younger generation, I think that's very critical. The other point, as with Mr. Parsons, it took him, what, 3 years, if I heard correctly, to work with that one individual. I know another individual out of the Washington, D.C. area from the music industry. His name was mentioned to me, Daryl Davis. Happened to play piano for Chuck Berry. And someone approached me and asked me, here when I was from the D.C. area, about him, and I thought I was going to talk to someone who had a music background. This was an anthropology professor who was teaching sociology. And Mr. Davis is a card-carrying member of the KKK. He happens to be a black man. And it took him 3 years, give or take, to convince a neighbor that he should give up his KKK membership. And this is the thing we have to deal with. It's not simple. It's quite an investment. It's almost one-on-one.
Okay, would you like to turn that into a question for the panel?
Well, do you have any comment on that long endeavor to change someone's true thinking?
Well, I would like to go back to your initial thoughts in reference to this being a generational issue. I have the good fortune of traveling the country and talking to colleges and universities. And if you have kids in college, you already know this. But the millennials and future generations are so much more accepting and diverse than we are or ever will be. I remember hosting Chaz Bono, who used to be Chastity Bono. He's Sonny and Cher's daughter, now son, at UCF. And I looked out over that audience of 250 kids, and half of those college students, I couldn't tell what gender they were. But the energy and the love in that room was palatable, because that wasn't important to them. There wasn't this othering, there wasn't this marginalization based on, who they love or what they look like or how they express their gender. And I thought to myself, that's what I hope our society looks like in my lifetime. I don't know if we'll get there, but at least in the next 50 years.
I actually have a question I'd like to pose to everyone, but just by a show of hands. We're talking about the other. How many of you, just by a show of hands, have within the past month, let's say, or even the past 6 months, gone out in some capacity? It could be the grocery store, it could be volunteering, it could be inviting people to your home, going to a new group. How many of you, by a show of hands, have personally, not reading, not watching TV, not talking about it, or going to a meetup group and discussing it, but actually went out and met up with people not like you? Anyone? You gotta say you did that too. Okay. All right. Next question, please. Go ahead.
The main question I have is, I mean, this is a college, universities, these panels and discussions and classes are going on. Why are we not having them before college and university and the schools? We could not do this. My daughter teaches middle school in Pinellas County. You couldn't do this in an auditorium full of middle school kids and have them ask you questions. You can't do it. Religion, you can't do it. Ask her.
I've been in trouble a few times for having conversations in my room regarding different things. I can tell you, though, that I teach my kids, never tell me that you don't like somebody unless you've had a conversation with them. That's what I've been teaching all of my students for the past 13 years.
Okay, thank you.
So,
all right, I'm looking. Okay.
Can I comment on that real quickly?
Sure. If that was a question, go
there's
right
a
ahead.
really there's a book I recommend. Check it out called Faith Ed, which actually chronicles what happened here in Tampa when I was invited to speak at a public school about Islam, along with a rabbi and a priest and others. And there was protests for over a year. And they literally tried to get me banned from the public schools. The children went on local media saying how much they loved the presentation, how it opened up their eyes, and how there was no preaching, and they just learned tolerance. But there was resistance from those same groups who would be against the LGBTQ community and others, the local hate groups, the Florida Family Association and others. But ultimately, they didn't have power as long as we didn't give them power, as long as our leaders had backbone and didn't give in to their demands, that they didn't. So we can't allow them to censor us, and I think we should push to have these kinds of conversations within the public schools, and it can be consistent within the law. And there may be some backlash, but it's not going to come from the mainstream, it's going to come from the hate groups, and we just have to be strong enough to keep them in check.
Okay. Thank you. Next. Thank you.
Hello. I have 2 questions for you. The first one I'd like to has to do with Angela, because she said something in her introductory remarks that kind of hit a spell for me, and that was that she expressed forgiveness for her, for the people that she was talking with. And it reminds me of something I was reading today about people that talk about couples that argue all the time, and one of the ways that you deal with this is that you ask them, if you have a miracle dream at night and you get up, what is the one thing that you can do so you can talk to each other, and they said, well, what can you do? And so I'd like to ask you if there's something that you can say, and I'll challenge everybody here to this, if you can say something to somebody that you can get along with them. It doesn't have to be a lot, it just has to be a small thing that you can do. And I think if everybody here does that, that will be like a ripple effect throughout society. Now, I'm just asking you if that's a viable thing to do. The second thing I'd like to ask you about is restorative justice. Now, we know, we've talked about our legislators, our representatives, and the fact that we don't have a means of actually talking with them. Once we're elected, we really don't have a means of communicating our desires, and they don't really talk with us. And in looking at restorative justice, it's not only for people in high school who have problems with each other, but it can also be used for things like people in South St. Petersburg who have problems with their housing or their schools. They should have an ability to go to the school board and say, look, you're not doing this for me. I'm not getting what I deserve. It's an injustice.
Okay. Can you put that into a question form
Okay, so what I'm asking is what do you think about these 2 types of behavior of modifications, or these things? Are they a viable way to go? Is there something that you would think about implementing? Long question, but
You know, the closest I could get to that is we do advocacy training. And we focus, as I said earlier, on shared values. And, you know, if you look at our world in like 3 concentric circles, there's, you know, the extreme this side, there's us over here, and then there's that movable middle in the middle. And those are people that, you know, with the right information and the right education could be moved to that place of love and acceptance and diversity and inclusion. So we try to focus in the movable middle on shared values that we all embrace. You know, like being able to raise a family and provide for your kids and hold a job and be able to buy a house without fear of discrimination. And those are things that everyone can pretty much agree on. So the best way I could answer that would be that is find those shared values that we all agree and then try to come together in that way.
You know, I know we've had actually a few extra minutes to ask questions, so I want to ask one of the panel here. And I hope everyone gives some thought to this. When you talk about shared values, anyone on the panel care to speak about the efficacy of having shared values, having conversations, being out in the community, finding commonalities, versus trying to accomplish things through legislation, new laws, politicking? Anyone want to comment here? What is more effective? What have you found?
Well, from a historical perspective, you find that legislation normally follows the community model. The legislative, we're talking about politicians, those who live and die with their career, which is based upon the clients voting them in. And from the 18th century on here, if you look at all the major ups and downs in our society, it was when a certain part of the society became so forcefully out there that the politicians feared retribution, and there had to be a change. But that always happened, and here's the good part. The most major profound changes in our country in race relations always happened when blacks and whites and other minorities came together and said, we've had enough. A change is necessary. And I'll leave this with you. If you look at from 1970 on, we are now in the midst of the quietest community that we've ever been. And that's a lick on us. What I mean is historically, we are in a stage and an era now where we object less than any other part in history. And just go home with that in mind. What we have begun to lower our standards of acceptance. And I'm gonna leave that with you. Check it out. From the time of the Klan to the time of the Compromise 1876, the retribution of the lynching wars through the beginning of the 20th century, leading into this terrible period of the 60s and the race riots, to the follow-on, the terrible time in the integration of schools in the 80s and 90s to now. If you look at the statistics, this is a period of when we have begun to object less than any other time. And as long as we do that, we have no control over our legislators. None.
Okay. Who's next? Okay, we have a question here, and I think we're almost ready to close. Go ahead.
How do we show unconditional love, and how do we work together as one?
I'll lead off and shut up. We have to have institutions at our core. Love is good, but in the reality of our nation and how we are so different from different backgrounds, love won't be enough, but it is a great start. But we must build that which will endure. People change over time. It's our institutions, and I'm going to keep saying that, those which have given us the ability to rebound and correct ourselves. America has had several corrections in its history where it has righted itself when it seemed like we were going down. So I would say how we have unconditional love, that's great, and we'll work on that. But we also need to prevent our institutions from failing us. The democratic process we have is the greatest in the world. And I am really worried that we have begun to allow that to decay. That of protecting our society, making decisions right. We should not be run by politicians. they should be doing and serving us at our will and doing what's right. And I'll leave that with you.
Okay. We have another question here. Yes.
My name's Bob. I'm Bob.
Hi, Bob.
I wonder if any of you, or maybe each of you, has a succinct example of a group of people like white folks or males or straight folks, grouping of them being able to deal with these values that we're talking about here. It's great to be part of this large group of people who have some similar values as I do, it sounds like. But as a white, male, straight guy, there aren't many guys around, and I have worked with some guys who have this feeling of fear to talk about it, fear of being called a racist to even talk about it, fear of being called sexist and so forth, to even bring it up. And they develop. So my solution is, I would think, to have some belonging groups where people are dealing with this. I wonder if you guys knew of any kind of groups like that.
Okay. Group speaking for, so give, again, the identity for your group would be straight white guy? I don't know. Okay. Afraid to bring it up. Okay. Comments?
I don't know of a specific group, but I think that's one of the things that we need to figure out is we should be able to air our grievances openly but respectfully, and to not be attacked, but to have conversations about them so we can start digging in and really finding solutions. So you're not alone there.
Okay, we have a gentleman in the back.
Just one question. Is hate regional? I moved from Dominican Republic in 1980 to New York, and I sit next to an Italian, a Greek, a Chinese, a Korean, so I did not have colors in my eyes. Is hate regional? Is it in big cities? Is it in small cities?
Well, I'll attack that in Florida, in the fact that we have been able to identify that in working to pass these human rights ordinances across the state. And it's interesting, I recently traveled up to Tallahassee, and from Orlando to Tallahassee, I went through 6 different counties, and depending on which of those 6 counties I passed through, I had different rights and protections in each one. In some of those counties, I could be harassed in the bathroom. In some of those counties, I could be refused service if someone read me as being transgender. Where other counties have passed these human rights ordinances and they, that would not happen. In the state of Florida, we do have, to a great extent, a progressive state, but there are pockets in Florida, the Panhandle, rural areas on the West Coast, Brevard County, Marion County, Volusia County are counties that are problem areas as far as conservative and more hate-filled, if you will. It's extreme, but not as progressive as the I-4 corridor, like St. Pete, Orlando, et cetera.
Were those places where you encounter hate very populated or less populated?
Less.
All right. Well, we're almost getting ready to finish, and then David's going to come up, but I feel like I need to answer this question, and I want to answer it on a universal level. Some who have read my biography know I've traveled quite a bit, 60 countries and counting, and I love going to visit different people. I will tell you, hate is regional. Hate will change its shape, its tone, its approach, all of the time, just based on the era that we're in, who's in charge, who feels marginalized. And I think one of the most confusing places for me, and I think this really says a lot, was when I went to Northern Ireland. I always was told I was half Irish. I get to Northern Ireland, and I realized, wait a minute, some people in Ireland consider themselves Brits, don't call me Irish. They all look exactly alike. Their names are the same. But the people in Northern Ireland consider themselves British and Protestant, and the people in Ireland 20 minutes away are Irish and they're Catholic. And those two groups that I could not tell the difference in would not talk with one another. So I would say, yes, hate is regional. Hate is as old as Adam and Eve's first offsprings. Didn't Cain kill Abel or something? We will see it over and over and over again, but I think tonight has been a very good conversation. I hope that we'll have more like this, and I would hope that everyone tonight will go out and look for ways to meet up with the other and really help get rid of some of those stereotypical thoughts that we've all been told. We do have, David, it's on you. Do we have time for one more question? Last one, go for it.
Good evening. My name's David. I'm from Toronto, and I've been to this event 3 or 4 times now. And thank God for America. It's a beautiful country. I find myself, and here's the question first. What would each of you say to us to help us be brave and have the courage and to be pleasant about objecting to what's going on in America, whether it be people carrying guns or the poor education level or the fellow who's doing all the talking today or tweeting. He denigrates perfectly great newspapers, and he talks about fake news, but he's the greatest practitioner of fake news. I don't want to say anything else because I got to be careful what I say.
You have to turn it into a question.
Yeah, the
Sorry,
question
otherwise it
is,
doesn't qualify.
and I think I already asked it, what would each of you say to us here tonight? Because as an example, if I'm sitting in my group over there in Indian Rocks Beach, I got to be careful who I'm with, because if I'm with Republicans, I got to be careful what I say. But what would you say to each of us to help us be brave and to have the courage to say, look, do you not understand what's going on here? Listen, we touched on World War II here, Germany pre-war, where they took away people's radios and they...
We need, David said one more question, but they won't have a chance to answer.
Please, help us be brave to speak our minds. Thank you.
Can I answer that?
Go right ahead.
Please. For me, I hope this helps to inspire you a little bit, but for me, having the opportunity to work with such diverse populations and working with populations who have survived genocide gives me the courage to keep raising my voice, knowing that there are individuals who have survived so much and they have not been bullied into silence. They have not been bullied into just accepting that kind of treatment or to watching their fellow human beings treated like that. And I think for me, that encourages me the most. So I hope that gives you a little bit of courage too.
Gina?
We say when they go low, we go local. And what that means is stay the course, stay involved, get involved, resist, and go to the polls, by God. You know, that's our voice. You know, there's marches going on all across the country pushing back against this divisiveness and hatred within our country. And the next step is we've got to elect progressive, unifying people in all levels of our government, starting with our school boards right here.
You know what, I may even have one last suggestion for this gentleman in the back, and this goes for everyone. Anyone who knows me well enough knows I go everywhere. Wherever you are and wherever the other people are, I am there. And this is what I do. I'm always listening. And I always, if somebody's on the left, I'll give them the story from the right. If someone's on the right, I'll give them the perspective from the left. But what I love to do is always invite by asking a question. And I think a question is far different from in your face, let me give you this statistic, let me tell you what happened here. But to ask a question, so whether you are feeling like you are the white straight man and you feel like, and the white straight man in the minority, and you feel like, oh, maybe it's my turn to be quiet, where years ago, maybe it was the black man who just really didn't feel he had a voice. I always think that asking a question, not a loaded question because you want to kill them, but a question that opens up dialogue and conversation goes so far in eliminating so much of the agitation, the strife, and the, I would say, the energizing emotions that really bring people from conversation to dissension to violence, and we don't want any of that, which I think at this point is a good time for us to welcome back to the stage the Executive Director, David Clement. Thank you all.
Thank you, panel, and thank you, Mara. Can we have a round of applause for the moderator who did such a great job? Well, while I'm acknowledging the success of this event, in my opinion, I'd like to offer my thanks to the staff of the Institute, Shantae, Jacqueline, Brianna, the student volunteer, Jonathan, student volunteers, Michael and Samantha, and I'm probably forgetting a few others. Thank you for your help in making everything work on time. And what an interesting evening. You all have given us a lot to think about and to take home to our neighborhoods and our circles. To the gentleman who asked, who I thought I heard you opine that you can't communicate with your elected officials. You can, and they listen if enough of us do. That is one thing we can do to change the conversation, is communicate with them often. Be a pest. And here's one other thing. A gentleman, one of the guests here, Mr. Nixon, Joseph Nixon, told me one thing we can do on February 4th, which I think is a week from Sunday. United Faith's Walk of Peace is holding a Walk of Peace, gathering at John Lawrence Pioneer Park in Dunedin, 400 Main Street, from 2 until 5 p.m. And if you want to get more information, the number is 727-733-4125. Reverend Becky Robbins Penniman. We could all show up there a week from Sunday afternoon and take part in a walk for peace. And now let me close by just giving you a heads up for our next program. On February 15th, March 27th, I'm sorry, on March 27th in this auditorium, we'll present a program on the cybersecurity battle. We're all facing invasion by hackers in our personal accounts, in our, for our national security, military, Congress, elections, wherever. We're going to be dissecting that at a dinner program on March 27th. And on February 15th, a very important program concerning Veterans Affairs. We're having the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs in DC here for a program, a forum on veterans issues. It's on this campus, but in the digital, no, I'm sorry, it's going to be right here, but it's not a dinner, it's an auditorium event. If you have any concerns about veterans issues or know someone who does, be sure and come. Thank you all for coming, and thank you again, panel and moderators. Good night.